So thank you for coming. Thank you very much. And I just wanted to introduce Yesha West, who I've seen over the years in the whaler, my whaler, their whaler, out in Spruce Island messing around and having fun. So that's my introduction as to how I know her. So very local to me, but her life has been very varied. Traveled all around the world, worked in multiple disciplines just to share with you, and she's going to bring all that together in what she's been working on over the last few years, which I think is pretty exciting. So please welcome Yesha West.
Edna Millay through the lens of her clothing. She was one of the most famous women in America in the 1920s and 1930s. And she created two ensembles of her clothing in what is called original practice, meaning using an antique sewing machine from 1906 and reference books from the turn of the century that teach you how to sew. Here are some of the pieces I've made in the past. They were used for my previous talk at the Historical Society in 2021, Gibson Girls in the Corset Myth. Tonight's talk will be a little more academic than my previous one. My work begins with the importance of studying clothing. From the moment of birth, we are enveloped by fabric. When a person sheds their clothing in order to wash or go to bed, it is generally understood to be a temporary condition. Indeed, the enduring condition of human experience is to be clothed in a second skin of textiles, and most of us make conscious choices about our second skin. This study allows not only a look at how Edna Millay chose to present herself to the world, revealing her desires, preferences, politics, and nuanced aspects of her inner being, but also how she chose to incorporate and respond to the culture and times as these changed over her lifetime. The dramatic changes in Western culture during these years can be traced through changes in material culture of clothing, particularly women's clothing. Material culture is an academic category of study that encompasses the physicality of society, including human-made objects, clothing, architecture, and other material items. Women's clothing in particular provides a useful historical record, since unlike men's clothing, fashions change drastically year by year and decade by decade. From accounts and letters, Millay was very attentive to the clothes she wore, making her an excellent candidate for this kind of study. Her life straddled the turn of the 20th century, 2 world wars, the Wright brothers' first flight, and women's suffrage in the United States. During this time, women's clothing underwent similarly unprecedented changes. For example, America's first national beauty standard for women, the end of the physical corset, and the social acceptability of women wearing trousers, to name but a few historic changes. My process of reconstruction of clothing in original practice uses techniques, tools, and machines proper to the time, to allow for a more thorough exploration of material culture of women's clothing during these years of cultural change. As part of this exploration, 2 ensembles from different periods of Millay's lifetime were recreated. One more feminine, here meaning skirts and dresses, and the other more masculine, meaning suit and tie. Fashion historian Kimberly Crispin Campbell writes in the introduction to her book, Skirts, Fashion and Modern Femininity in the 20th Century, quote, "Dresses have long been synonymous with femininity in Western culture," end quote. She also discusses how the term skirts began in the 15th century as a slang term for women. The first ensemble I made is a dress from 1914 showing the iconic photograph taken by Arnold Gambit of Millay among magnolia blossoms, the image on the left. The second is a suit, shirt, and skirt featured in the 1925 publicity photo for a new volume of poetry taken by Berenice Abbott, the image on the right. These ensembles are made to fit me, so I can therefore offer additional comments on what it was like to wear the clothing. While wearing the clothing, it is important to remember I can only approach this through a contemporary lens. My history and relationship with clothing is that of someone born in 1997, not 1892. Any conclusions I draw must be caveated appropriately. When discussing gender roles in the late Victorian period, Peter G. Filene wrote in 1986, quote, "Late 20th century Americans do not interpret experience in the same terms as Like tourists in a foreign country, we must try to understand women of the Victorian culture in their own terms rather than ours. It is easy to pity or attack their situation. It is harder and more instructive to comprehend how they dealt with it. This approach can be applied to the conclusions drawn from historical recreations. Something I am often asked by people who have never worn historical clothing is it comfortable? While that may seem like a straightforward question, it is not. I always answer you need to redefine what you consider comfortable. Any historical garment will not be like a pair of elasticated sweatpants because it is clothing that is made to fit you exactly. This is before the widespread use of elastic in fabric and clothing. Some examples of this include a non-stretch waistband that is exactly your waist measurement, a corset that over time is shaped to your exact torso, or a skirt that is hemmed to your precise height. When wearing historical garments, one needs to try and set aside what one considers comfortable in the modern sense and think about the historical construction of the clothing. This is why making the clothing an original practice is so important. The act of patterning, sewing, and fitting the clothing helps to understand why it fits a certain way and how one wears it. I will now give a biographical summary of Millay, followed by a discussion of her clothing and my recreations. My biographical summary was gleaned from the study of 9 biographical texts published from 1951 to 2017. This body of biographical literature is a substantial part of the resource material for this work. A particular note are What Lips My Lips Have Kissed, 2001, by poet and dramatist Daniel Mark Epstein, who accessed Millay's file in the Library of Congress. Restless Spirit, 1962, by historian and biographer Miriam Gerko, who exchanged many letters with Millay's first male lover, Floyd Dell. However, in my opinion, the closest one to a complete biography is Savage Beauty by American biographer Nancy Milford. Milford was given access to all of Millay's papers by Millay's sister Norma. No other biographer has had access to these papers. Milford also interviewed Norma and others close to Millay. Norma was notoriously protective of Millay's legacy and reputation, so granting Milford access as she did allowed for the only truly thorough biography to be written. Other biographies acknowledge that they are not complete because of the lack of access to these papers. Through this resource material, I will additionally examine Millay's relationship with homosexuality, masculinity, and femininity, and how her choice of clothing reflects these relationships as indicated in letters and diary entries. To avoid confusion as to who I'm referring to, Edna St. Vincent Millay, who throughout her life was often called Vincent, I will refer to as Millay. Her sisters Norma and Kathleen, her mother Cora, father Henry, and husband Eugene Wasabane will be referred to by their first names. So who was Edna St. Vincent Millay? Edna St. Vincent Millay was born in Rockport, Maine, February 22, 1892. Her mother Cora Bazell and father Henry Tolman Millay were married March 17, 1889. Millay was given the name St. Vincent after the hospital in New York City where Cora's brother's life was saved shortly before her birth. When Millay was a few weeks old, the family moved to Union, Maine. Her younger sisters, Norma and Kathleen Millay, were born December 28, 1893 and May 19, 1896, respectively. Henry, who was unable to hold down a job, was evicted by Cora while Millay was still young. He never returned, but occasionally sent the girls money, although not enough to live on. The divorce testimony cited bitter abuse from Henry towards Cora. In 1904, Cora moved the girls to Camden, Maine, and took a job as a traveling nurse, taking cases wherever someone would pay her to care for the sick in their own homes. Millay was 12, Norma 11, and Kathleen 9. Daniel Mark Epstein writes, quote, "The sisters had to grow up fast," end quote. This was especially true for Millay as the eldest. Cora would send money home to the girls and left Millay in charge of the household and her younger sisters. There was a schedule that survives in Millay's handwriting entitled "Do It Now," dictating what each sister would do throughout the day, each completing household and school-related tasks. Millay attended Camden High School, graduating, quote, with her class in June 1909 in a white long dress made by her Aunt Sue, end quote. At age 11 in 1904, she began writing poems and publishing them in the St. Nicholas League, a monthly illustrated magazine for children. Many of her childhood poems were printed and some winning prizes. Cora taught her daughters Shakespeare and how to sing in harmonies that always encouraged them to perform. Millay acted in professional plays at the Camden Opera House during this time and was highly praised, perhaps discovering for the first time the power of her speaking voice, a voice that would hold much power over others through the following Millay was 5'1" with red hair. At age 19, she traveled to Kingman, Maine to look after her father, Henry, who they thought was dying, although he eventually recovered. On this trip, she was free of restraints of domestic life for the first time in her life. She loved this freedom. Her mother and sisters begged for letters and eventually asked her to return home. Millay did not want to go back home. Eventually, Cora lured her back with the temptation of the Lyric Year, a 1912 publication of the best poetry in America that year. The first prize was $500, which was much needed by the family. Both Millay and Cora submitted pieces, and Millay's epic poem Renaissance was selected. At the beginning of Renaissance mentions the Camden Hills, Penobscot Bay, Islesboro, North Haven, and Vinyl Haven. All I could see from where I stood was 3 long mountains and a wood. I turned and looked the other way and saw 3 islands in the bay. So with my eyes I traced the line of the horizon thin and fine, straight around till I was come back to where I started from. And all I could see from where I stood was 3 long mountains and a wood. The publication of Renaissance began 2 friendships with Widow Dinner and Arthur Davidson Fickey, which would prove important for the rest of Millay's life. They wrote her a joint letter to which she responded, informing them that she was in fact a woman of 20 and not a man of 45, which they had assumed from reading Renaissance. Both Binner and Fickey had poems published in the Lyric Year. In a letter dated April 12, 1913 to Fickey, Millay refers to him as her spiritual advisor, a title that he would hold for the rest of their lives. While Millay's poetry was gaining notoriety among other American poets and writers, she was still a poor young woman in a small Maine town. In the summer of 1912, Norma took a job as a waitress at the Whitehall Inn in Camden. One evening, a party was held for staff, where Norma brought Millay along to sing and recite her poems. She recited Renaissance, so thoroughly impressing one of the hotel guests in the audience, Miss Caroline Dow, that when Dow returned to New York, she raised funds among her wealthy friends for Millay to attend college. Millay chose to attend Vassar over Smith College, as many Maine girls attended Smith. She began at Vassar, hating the rules and regulations imposed by the school. Elizabeth Hazelton Haight, a friend and Latin professor at Vassar, wrote, quote, "A women's college in 1917 had many social rules, and their infringement carried penalties," end quote. Millay was involved in the theater and had her own plays produced by the school. According to Haight, Millay gained tremendous popularity within the student body for her acting and writing. She often ran into disciplinary problems for not following the rules. Remember that she had already had to act as head of the household and raise her sisters since she was 12 years old. She was 21 when she began freshman year at Vassar, the same age as many of the seniors. An illicit outing with friends in 1917 was the final straw, and she was barred from attending convocation and graduating with her class. Instead, her diploma would be shipped to her. However, vigorous lobbying from her classmates prevailed, and Vassar eventually allowed her to graduate with her class. After graduation in 1917, she moved to Greenwich Village in New York City, hoping to pursue acting with the help of Edith Wynne Matheson, an actress who she met while at Vassar. Her first book of poems was published the same year by Mitchell Carnegie. She published poems in left-wing magazines, The Masses, and later The Liberator, run by Floyd Dell, Max Eastman, and Edna Wilson. Dell and Wilson each proposed marriage, but both were refused. She began acting and eventually directing her own plays at the Provincetown Players in Greenwich Village. Millay eventually brought Norma and Kathleen to Greenwich Village, and a little later Cora. They would hold parties, with each sister holding court in different rooms and Cora moving between them. At this time, Millay was supporting her whole family with her writing, except for Kathleen, who was attending Vassar on money raised again by Caroline Dow. Kathleen and Norma would marry first, Kathleen to Howard Young and Norma to Charles Ellis, a painter. Upon marriage, all the sisters continued to use Millay as their last name. Millay had a brief affair in 1917 with Arthur Fickey when they finally met in person after years of correspondence. They had 3 days together before he was sent to France during World War I. Floyd Dell, the first man Millay ever slept with, at least according to Dell, later wrote in his memoir of Millay, quote, "Arthur and Edna fell visibly in love," end quote. Fickey later met Gladys Brown, a painter whom he married. Fickey and Millay remained close friends for the rest of his life. By late 1910 and the early 1920s, Millay's poems grew in popularity. Vincent Sheehan, a friend and biographer, quotes after the publication for a second volume of poetry, A Few Figs from Thistles in 1920, when she, quote, awoke one morning to find herself famous. She published a sonnet in 1920 known as Sonnet 43 that references her childhood on the Maine coast. I shall go back again to the bleak shore and build a little shanty on the sand in such a way that the extremest band of brittle seaweed will escape my door, but by a yard or two, and never more shall I return to take you by the hand. I shall be gone to what I understand, and happier than I ever was before. The love that stood a moment in your eyes, the words that lay a moment on your tongue, are one with all that in a moment dies, a little undersaid and oversung, but I shall find the sullen rocks and skies, unchanged from what they were when I was young. In early 1921, she sailed for Paris to write. She was commissioned by Vanity Fair to write prose under a pen name Nancy Boyd. They offered to pay her more to publish under her own name, however she wanted to preserve Edna St. Vincent Millay exclusively for poetry. She lived in Paris and traveled Europe writing. Millay eventually brought Cora out to Paris to live with her. Nancy Milford claims that Millay became pregnant in Paris and she and Cora left for England, where Cora helped abort the baby using herbs from the 17th century herbalist volume by Nicholas Culpeper. This illustrates the extent to which Nancy Milford was able to penetrate Millay's life. Miriam Gurko, for instance, in her 1962 biography, suggests that during this time in England, Millay, quote, was having intestinal trouble, brought on perhaps by bad food and general neglect of her health in Albania and post-war Vienna and Hungary. Returning to America in early 1923, her younger sister's marriage, Millay now considered herself an adult maid at age 31. Millay would soon meet, and shortly thereafter marry, Eugen Jan Boissevin, born 1880, died 1949, a Dutch coffee importer who had previously been married to suffragist Inez Milholland, who died tragically young in 1917. Eugen was not intimidated by his wife being more influential than himself. They married in Croton-on-Hudson, New York, July 18, 1923. Millay was ill and entered the hospital the next day for an operation for appendicitis and a twisted intestine. She wrote at the time of her marriage, "If I die now, I shall be immortal." Miriam Gurko wrote, quote, "Eugen took care of everything. He gave up his business to devote himself to Edna. Eugen insisted upon relieving her of every kind of domestic responsibility, saying that a lyric poet must not have her sensitivities dulled by the routine details of housework." End quote. They had an open marriage. Millay won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 1923, the first woman to ever win, for her poem Ballad of the Heartweaver. In 1925, Millay and Eugen would buy Steepletop, a working farm in Austerlitz, New York. This is near Great Barrington, Massachusetts. They lived there on and off for the rest of their lives. They often entertained friends and guests playing tennis on the court near their house and swimming naked in the sunken pool in the garden. In 1925, Millay was approached by American composer Deems Taylor to write the libretto for his new opera commissioned by the Metropolitan Opera. Quote, "No American opera had been produced by the Metropolitan since 1917. The native composers began to complain they were being unfairly discriminated against." End quote. She wrote The King's Henchman based on Anglo-Saxon mythology. The opera premiered February 17, 1927, to huge success. Additionally, in 1927, Millay became involved with the Sacco and Vanzetti case. Two Italian immigrant anarchists were accused of murder and sentenced to death. Many believed that they were wrongfully accused and targeted for speaking little to no English and for their anarchist release. Millay joined a picket line in Boston and was arrested for sauntering and loitering and was bailed out by Eugen. See the middle photo. She also spoke to the governor of Massachusetts, urging him to stay the execution. Both these efforts were unsuccessful, and Sacco and Vanzetti were executed. It is at this time that she had one significant romantic relationship outside of her marriage. This was with poet George Dillon, 14 years her junior, who she met in 1928. The sonnets in her book Fatal Interview, published 1931, were supposedly based on their relationship. In 1933, Millay and Eugen bought Ragged Island off the coast of Maine near Harpswell. Quote, "Ragged Island consisted of about 50 wild acres surrounded by high rock ledges with only one tiny harbor," end quote. They would spend parts of the summer there, sometimes inviting friends. On both the island and at Steepletop, Millay and Eugene lived removed from society, generally only seeing friends by invitation. A serious event occurred in 1936 when Millay was riding in the car and the door accidentally swung open around a bend, resulting in her being thrown out. Her arm was seriously injured and she was therefore prescribed morphine for the pain. Millay eventually began taking it around the clock and became addicted. There are detailed diaries that document every injection she had, but she was eventually able to quit the morphine after a hospital stay. She had also been drinking alcohol very heavily, however, this was not something she was ever able to quit. Throughout the 1930s, Millay would go on reading tours of the United States in order to promote her books, as well as when money was running short. The tours were extremely successful, and these events were selling out with overflow room and standing crowds. An example of her popularity can be seen within the midst of the Great Depression in the West, when just 8 weeks after the publication of Blind Willie's Grapes in 1934, it had sold an astounding 35,000 copies, with a U.S. population at the time of almost 131 million, which is the equivalent of more than 900,000 copies today. The popularity culminated in the summer of 1938 when Millay was voted one of America's most famous women. By 1940, Millay's life was plagued with ill health and struggles with alcoholism. In addition to these struggles, Eugene passed away in 1949 of cancer. Millay was deeply affected by Eugene's death. However, a year later, she was writing once again. On the evening of October 19, 1950, she left a note for her housekeeper about the temperature of the iron and proceeded to walk upstairs with her wine glass and bottle. On her way up, she suffered a heart attack and fell down the stairs. She was found dead on the flagstone entranceway the next morning. When Millay died, she was wearing, quote, her silk dressing gown and slippers. Her sister Norma moved into the house and slept in Millay's bedroom, but did not move anything from when Millay had lived there. Millay's clothes remained in the closet, knickknacks left on the mantle, etc. And the house remains like that to this day. Millay's fame is not as large today as it was during her lifetime. Unlike some artists, she did not become more famous after death. My theory as to why is because she wrote a lot of propaganda poetry before and during World War II. Critics hated her for it. She also considered it to be pad poetry, but felt since she had no sons to give to the conflict, the only thing she could give was her reputation as a poet. I really like her poetry from this time. Her poem, There Are No Islands Anymore, from 1941, about the imminent threat of invasion to the UK and American isolationism is particularly moving. Here you can see a Millay postage stamp from the 1980s, Renaissance written in the Camden Public Library, and a plaque on her residence in Greenwich Village, New York City. Millay's voice and physical presence held tremendous magnetism, drawing crowds and lovers to her throughout her lifetime. With her small stature and red hair, she created a striking image, often being referred to in the press as the girl poet. Millay's sexuality was an important part of her life. As Daniel Mark Epstein writes, quote, she found two sources of strength that would sustain her, poetry and erotic love. Millay was known for writing shocking love sonnets that many biographers connect back to her personal life. I will discuss Millay's relationship to homosexuality and her relationship to her husband Eugene, which was perhaps the most important as it crossed typical gendered roles at the time. The crossing of typical gendered lines in her personal life is reflected in both her clothing and the nature of her marriage. The crossing of these lines has also influenced the choice of garments I chose to recreate in order to more fully and accurately explore Millay's life, circumstances, desires, and choices. Before and during Millay's time at Vassar, she only had sexual relations with women. Millay wrote about the rules at Vassar in a 1914 letter to Arthur Fickey, quote, they trust us with everything but men. A man is forbidden as if he were an apple. She did not have the means while living at home in Camden or at Vassar, where physical contact with men is essentially forbidden, to seek out heterosexual sexual relationships. Miriam Gurker writes that in Camden, Millay was not interested in boys. She explains that boys would come to the house but always to see Nora or Kathleen, not Millay. However, we know from letters quoted in Nancy Milford's biography that Millay did carry on emotional affairs with men prior and during her time at Vassar. Once she was free of the rules enforced by Vassar and living in Greenwich Village, she slept with men and women as she pleased. I argued that Millay was, in her own words, neither heterosexual nor homosexual, but both. Millay's friend Max Eastman wrote about how once at a party, Millay had a headache and was approached by a young doctor who said he might be able to help. They went to a private room and he began to try and psychoanalyze her, something she notoriously disliked. He eventually got to his point, her sexuality. Her response was, as Eastman writes, quote, "Oh, you mean I'm homosexual? Of course I am, and heterosexual too, but what's that got to do with my headache?" Historian Lillian Faderman writes about lesbian life in 20th century America in her 1992 book, Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers. She discusses Millay in her sections on bohemians in Greenwich Village. Faderman asserts that for Millay, quote, to have chosen to live as a lesbian, even in the world of Greenwich Village, was too problematic for her, despite her history of love for other women, end quote. Faderman also paints Millay's marriage delusion as Millay, quote, having succumbed to the pressure, end quote, to marry a man. However, I feel Faderman is binary in her conclusions, not allowing for the full complexity of Millay's sexuality. Throughout the majority of her private life, Millay did exactly as she pleased and damned the consequences. It is also possible that over her life, Millay's preference for men and women changed. When she was younger, perhaps she preferred women, and later in life, her desire shifted more towards men. Faderman also takes quotes out of context. For instance, where Millay is quoted as saying that she and Eugen lived like two bachelors. This was said in 1931, 8 years into their marriage. Is it not possible that their relationship changed over time? Most Millay biographies tell of a time when Millay and Eugen, before they were a couple, played lovers in a play set at a party with friends, including Floyd Dell. Dell wrote, quote, "They took their roles literally, and albeit unconsciously, fell in love to their own vast surprise, right before everyone's eyes." Floyd Dell admitted that Millay was never cured of a sexual interest in women. There was a very deep attachment between Millay and Eugen. Millay relied very heavily on Eugen, especially in her later years. In 1931, Millay is quoted as saying, quote, "I have nothing to do with my household," end quote, saying that that was Eugen's job. As he mentioned more than once, he took care of her like his child. He gave up much of his work to look after her and allow her to write. This swap of traditional gender roles is perhaps a culmination of what Millay's life had always been heading towards. With a brief overview illustrating Millay's complicated sexuality, I will further examine her relationship with presenting as masculine, in other words, wearing trousers. As I read biographical texts of Millay, I made note of any mention of clothing and found the mentions of her wearing trousers particularly interesting because they broke the rules of fashionable clothing for women at the time. Though the mentions of trousers are few, they are important to Millay's self-expression and the separations which she makes between her private and public life. As well, since I have decided to recreate one of Millay's more masculine ensembles, although not trousers, this discussion is intended to provide a broader context for understanding the particularities of Millay's clothing choices. Throughout my research, I uncovered 5 mentions of Millay's wearing trousers. The first was on stage when she took the role of Marjoribanks in Vassar's production of George Bernard Shaw's Candida in March 1915. She dressed as the boy poet in love with the heroine and wore bobbed hair, a black tie, and artist robe. Daniel Mark Epstein quotes a letter to her family. "I felt perfectly at home in the clothes. People told me I reminded them of their brothers, the way I walked around and slung my legs over the arms of chairs, etc. Somebody thought I really was a boy. Somebody thought it was wonderful the way I used my trousers and walked and stuck my hands in the pockets across my legs, as if I myself didn't notice I was doing it." This quote is interesting since Millay is playing, impersonating, and acting as a boy. She was aware of her choice of movements, even perhaps having studied men in order to learn how they move differently from women. Or perhaps it was Millay's innate acting ability on display. Her assertion that she felt perfectly at home in the clothes tells us that at least in her 20s, she was in some part comfortable wearing men's clothing. I believe this shows that Millay had a certain fluidity about her. I would suggest here that she had a range of clothing and associated personas that she felt at home in, which ranged from long dresses to trousers. She was to incorporate trousers into her private life over the next 35 years. However, in her public life, as seen in photographs and through written descriptions, she would present as fashionable and feminine. Another mention took place on Ragged Island and was described by Vincent American journalist and novelist in The Indigo Bunting, his memoir of Millay. Sheehan describes Millay wearing jeans and a sports shirt, both men's garments. He later described the same jeans as overalls. Biographer Nancy Milford also notes Millay wearing overalls on Ragged Island. According to Smith College theater professor Kiki Smith in Real Clothes, Real Lives, 200 Years of What Women Wore, the Smith College Historic Clothing Collection, women's overalls began during the First World War. Quote, in 1916, a patent was issued for women's overalls with a bib front, straps, and legs gathered by elastic at the ankle, end quote. By 1917, they were being sold in Sears and Roebuck's catalog. Smith writes that their popularity faded after World War I, but had a resurgence of popularity in the 1930s. This instance of Millay wearing overalls was likely in the 1930s based on when Vincent Sheehan visited the island. Perhaps she preferred practicality in a rural setting. I was sent a document titled The Steepletop Garment Database by the Millay Society that details clothing left behind in her Austerlitz, New York home. It lists 7 pairs of sleeping or lounging trousers out of 154 items, many of which are purses, hats, and shoes. Since there are so many pairs, I think it is safe to assume she often wore trousers to bed or around the house, certainly in her later years. By the end of her life, these were the only trousers in the collection, although I was informed that the database is not complete. Finally, Millay's trousers were featured in the exhibition, Influencers 1920s Fashion in the New Woman, at the Lyndhurst Mansion in Tarrytown, New York, which I visited September 2024. This exhibition and catalog are the only instance I have found of a reference to Millay's biography through her clothing. 2 ensembles of Millay's clothing were exhibited. A Chinese silk pantsuit meant for housewear, also documented in the Steepletop Garment Database, and riding breeches and a jacket with a white collared shirt and man's tie. A photograph of Millay wearing riding breeches was included in the catalog. This is among only 5 photographs, 3 online and 2 in a biography, that I have been able to find of Millay wearing her trousers, all of which are very casual photos. According to the catalog and exhibition descriptions, they represent that Millay and her clothing was ahead of its time and that she influenced other women and was wearing trousers before it became socially acceptable. I question this representation as well as some of the historical information provided within this catalog, all having to do with inaccuracies in Victorian women's clothing. If you're curious about these things, you can see my previous talk at the Historical Society. In the catalog, Influencers 1920s Fashion in the New Woman, the authors extrapolate using Millay's clothing as evidence that she was a pioneer and radical woman by wearing trousers. However, the authors only used cherry-picked examples to support their claims. As discussed, she did wear trousers, however, mostly at home or in the company of her husband. There is, as far as I have been able to find, only 3 accessible photographs online of Millay in trousers, all likely taken in the 1930s or 1940s. The one image that was selected for the catalog in order to prove their thesis of Millay as, quote, a pioneer and radical woman, end quote, can be seen on the far right. Given the scope of her career and extent of her wardrobe, I believe it is more likely that her true fashion influence, if any, would have been during the public readings of her poems she did across the United States starting as early as 1913. In relation to the clothing at one of these readings, she writes home in a letter dated September 22nd, 1917 to her family about the host for the reading. My trunk hasn't come in, so she dressed me up in something of hers, a gown with a train and hanging about 6 inches on the floor all around, made out of 3 rainbow-colored scarves. And family, I have discovered I have nothing to give readings in. I must have long dresses, trailing ones, short ones won't do. During her reading tours of the country in the 1930s, newspapers often commented on her fashionable apparel. They often commented on her swishing the train of her gown around at certain moments for emphasis. She was described by one reporter as wearing, quote, a stunning gown of red velvet trimmed with gilt braid and a black velvet cape. While Millay herself described the reading gowns as costumes, so perhaps not what she would have chosen to wear except while on display, she often wore what was described as a suit for interviews or work. There are 3 suits from the 1940s found in the Steepletop Garment Database. An important note is that all of the suits contain skirts, not trousers. Kiki Smith notes that slap suits emerged in the 1930s, though were more popular by the 1940s. For instance, author Frederick Krokosch, described a meeting with Millay in 1934 where she was wearing, quote, a gray flannel suit with blue striped shirt and a green silk cravat, end quote. It is unlikely that she was wearing trousers, as this would have likely been remarked upon. There is a photograph of Millay in a suit and tie taken in 1925 that was used to help publicize her first volume of poetry after winning the Pulitzer Prize. In 1925, Berenice Abbott took this publicity photograph for Millay's book, The Buck in the Snow, published in 1928. Millay appears to be wearing a soft-collared shirt with a silk tie and black jacket. Beneath the tie on the collar is a pin, drawing the collar points together, giving a similar impression to a masculine Oxford shirt. The shirt has cuffs which poke out of the jacket sleeves. The jacket is fairly unstructured with what could be an understated camp collar. There are 3 large buttons arranged vertically below her elbow. These appear to be part of the jacket, and that hangs low over her hips with no waistline. This is a popular 1920s women's style. She also appears to have a knee-length skirt with a stocking knee poking out of the left-hand corner of the photograph. Upon closer inspection, she is in fact wearing a fashionable 1920s women's suit, although perhaps with a masculine flavor, especially with the shirt and tie. Biographer Nancy Milford describes Millay in this photograph as dressed like a young man. She also stated that she can find no contemporary commentary on this unusual presentation, and it is also not remarked upon in any other biography of Millay. Lillian Faderman gives an example of a woman dressing masculine on top. Dr. Sarah Josephine Baker in the early 20th century wore shirt waists, stiff collars, and men-tailored suits with boring hand ties to work. Faderman quotes Baker, quote, I badly needed protective clothing so that when a masculine colleague of mine looked around the office in a rather critical state of mind, no feminine furbelows would catch his eye and give him an excuse to become irritated by the presence of a woman where, according to him, a woman had no right to be. I wore a costume, almost a uniform, because the last thing I wanted to be was conspicuously feminine when working with men, end quote. Faderman also discusses women passing as men in the early 20th century and how, quote, unlike the latter half of the 20th century, women never wore pants. A person in pants would be assumed to be male, and only the most suspicious would have scrutinized facial features and body movements to discern a woman beneath the external appearance, end quote. She writes that women mostly cross-dressed to earn a man's wage rather than to have relationships with women, as usually the wages paid to women were not enough to make ends meet. Kiki Smith writes about a 1920 suit in the Smith College clothing collection where the suit was likely a man's suit made for a woman to pass as a man. She also writes, women, quote, who dressed in men's clothing could be accused of exhibiting deviant behavior, arrested, and even confined to a mental institution, end quote. For example, in Paris, it was illegal for a woman to wear trousers unless the police gave her permission, and this law was on the books until 2013. In New York City, there's an instance where a woman was arrested in 1933 for wearing trousers. Rusty Brown, a New York lesbian, remembers a law where, quote, you had to have 3 pieces of female attire when in public. Because Millay was the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 1923, these clothing choices in the photograph were perhaps a way of her demonstrating that she belonged with all previous male winners. To say, this is what a Pulitzer Prize winner looks like. Kiki Smith writes that, quote, most men's suits in the 1920s consisted of 3 pieces, a jacket, pants, and a vest. Millay's clothing was therefore not fully masculine, as she was missing the vest and trousers. Her suit can definitely be classed as mostly women's clothing. The traditional role of the man is prevalent in Millay's story. Millay referenced herself using male pronouns in letters, and her transformation of herself into a little boy in her Pulitzer Prize-winning poem Ballad of the Heart Weaver reinforces the culturally gendered role she fulfilled for her family. She was the main breadwinner in adulthood and head of the household while her mother was away during childhood. As the oldest of her sisters in childhood, she needed to be the responsible one. Daniel Mark Epstein writes that Millay was, quote, a girl whose childhood was taken away from her too soon, end quote. Once in Greenwich Village, she was the one financially supporting most of the family, something that continued for the rest of her life. In other words, she was filling the role that a father or husband was expected to take. This cultural male role rarely appears physically in Millay photographs, except for the 1925 outlet publicity photographs. Miriam Gerko writes, quote, "Whether or not the boyish name had anything to do with it, Vincent, growing up, had more of the freedoms ordinarily granted to boys rather than to girls," end quote. It is not clear what freedoms exactly she is referring to, but perhaps it has to do with the lack of parental control while Cora was away working. Gerko later writes, quote, "At home in Maine, she had been free to yield to virtually any impulse. At Vassar, smoking was completely banned, a restriction she evaded by taking her cigarettes off campus to a nearby cemetery. Later, after graduation, she continued to yield to any impulse she desired. At Vassar, she went by Vincent, although she was glad to embrace her feminine side. Nancy Milford cites a letter she wrote home while at Vassar describing school dances where half the girls would dress up as men. Millay was glad to be short, as it meant she could dress as a girl. You can see her in the middle there in a dark dress with a V-neck. E. Vincent Millay, the name she published under in childhood, was known by the children's magazine, the St. Nicholas League, as Master Millay, a boy's designation from age 11 to 18 when she finally corrected him. In the past, many women authors did not present as women for professional reasons, and this common practice included authors such as George Eliot and more recently J.K. Rowling. The same assumption happened when Renaissance was published. Letters addressed to Millay assumed she was a man. In response to Ritter Binner and Arthur Ficky's assumption that Renaissance had been written by, quote, "a brawny male of 45, end quote, not a woman of 20, Millay responded, "I cling to my femininity." The word choice here is very interesting. Why cling? Perhaps with Vincent, beginning to fill the role of the man supporting her family financially, she needed to cling to it as though her femininity was something that could easily slip away. Growing up in a predominantly woman-only household, Daniel Mark Epstein writes that she, quote, "had grown up in a household of singularly independent women and no men." Millay and her sisters would sometimes use male pronouns in letters to each other, referring to each other as young man. At this time, going by the name Vincent Daly when a woman using a man's name was uncommon, is another example of masculine language from her childhood. Perhaps this was her way of imagining that there was a man in the household at a time when men were expected to provide and they did not have this kind of support. This lack of traditional male household role model is something that would continue on and off for the rest of Millay's life. While the 1925 suit ensemble might be thought of as Millay expressing her homosexual interests by presenting as both masculine and feminine, her choice of wearing a masculine top and a skirt below the waist is still a relatively conventional choice. Let's consider for a moment what the effect might be if a powerful woman in 1925 had publicized images of the reverse. A feminine top with trousers below the waist. I think it would have been much more unsettling and revolutionary. In her master's thesis, Karen DeLutis discusses the dress reform movement in the mid to late 1800s. She describes this as a heterosexual reform movement that promoted types of trousers and other changes in dress for women. While the movement never caught on to the mainstream, DeLutis details examples of trousers on women being banned in various locations until the mid-1980s. She described, this underscores the controversial aspects of a woman in a bifurcated garment. I would surmise, based on the lack of contemporary and later biographical comment on these 1925 photographs, that what matters most here is what is worn below the waist. The man's shirt and tie hold less, although still some disruptive power, than a pair of trousers on the woman would have. Fashion designer Miuccia Prada, in a 2006 interview with the New York Times, stated, quote, "The skirt is a feminine symbol. To me, the waist up is more spiritual, more intellectual, while the waist down is more basic, more grounded. It's about sex, it's about making love, it's about life, it's about giving birth. Basically, below the waist is more connected to the earth," end quote. Millay is dressed as a woman with a touch of the masculine, rather than dressed as masculine with a touch of the feminine. In many ways, this ensemble describes her character in these years as the breadwinner of the family, who can be both feminine and masculine at the same time. Sociologist Diana Crane describes how a woman wearing a tie in the 19th century was a feminist act and, quote, an expression of independence, end quote, and an assault on masculine privilege. Millay wore a tie on multiple occasions. The tie in the 1925 photograph has, I believe, a significance to her being the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for poetry. Crane explains, quote, fashionable clothing exemplified the doctrine of separate spheres that was supported by other social institutions, end quote. Millay was crossing the separation between male and female spheres when she won the Pulitzer. Design historian Penny Spark, writing about the separation of public and private spheres in her book, As Long as It's Pink, The Sexual Politics of Taste, explains how historically women acted in the private realm and men in the public. Spark contends, quote, the separation of spheres relegated women to the world of domesticity, end quote. Millay's place as the breadwinner of her family and her husband Eugene's position in charge of the household was a reversal of this social norm. From her unconventional childhood to supporting her mother and sisters in the 1920s to her final marriage and fame, she filled the traditional man's role and was reflected more in her personal and private clothing, riding breeches, overall, sports shirt on Ragged Island, with the exception of the 1925 Berenice Abbott publicity photograph. With Abbott's photograph being an exception to most other photographs taken of Millay, it is also important to examine one of the most famous feminine ensembles worn by Millay. Perhaps the most widely circulated photograph of Millay is a photograph of her amongst magnolia blossoms wearing a very fashionable tan linen dress. In 1914, Arnold Genthe took this photograph of his publisher's house in Mamaroneck, New York. Genthe took many portraits of celebrities over the course of his career. This photo shows Millay in a linen dress with a sailor's collar, or midi collar, peplum, and square buttons down the front. Nancy Milford describes this photo as a, quote, single shot of her standing among the magnolia blossoms that would become the blaze that marked an era in American poetry as her own. Millay writes about this dress in a letter home. I have paid $10.50 for a tan linen tailored cutie so becoming a white muslin collar spring dress I really need to wear to college. The collar of this dress is worth noting as I believe it gives us clues to its type and social acceptability. There is a second photo of Millay at Vassar in a coat where she is sitting outside. Millay this coat has the same type of sailor's collar as the tan linen dress. Millay began at Vassar in 1913. This type of collar was fashionable and appropriate for college, perhaps even that attracted Millay to the dress and coat. Nancy Milford quotes a classmate of Millay's talking about how Vassar wasn't a college for rich girls. Quote, we all wore middies, which was a sort of leveling uniform. Middies are a type of sailor's top, the name deriving from the uniform of midshipmen in the U.S. Navy. This collar became very popular with schoolgirls, both college and high school. A variation of the midi blouse was the Peter Thompson dress. Quote, Peter Thompson was a tailor in the Navy who had taken the midi blouse and added a pleated skirt to it. Many private schools for girls eventually adopting it as a uniform, end quote. Originally from masculine sailors' clothing, a midi collar is the type of collar on both the tan linen dress and the coat. On the left, you can see the Islesboro High School girls basketball team from 1927 wearing middies. Millay's classmate continued, quote, although it is true, one knew if one were observant that certain middies were from Wanamaker's, or they might be from Pauline's, end quote. The tan linen dress was bought from a parlor in Wanamaker's department store in New York City. Millay would have been considered from a lower class. Miriam Gerber states, quote, it probably never occurred to her to go to college. College was not in the pattern for poor young girls living in little Maine towns, end quote. Millay's excitement over the dress and her description to her mother and sisters suggests that the dress was important to her. Nancy Milford concludes, quote, she was a girl who wanted to be beautiful and well-liked and powerful in her class at Vassar. With Millay's clothing budget coming from Miss Dow, she was shopping at Wanamaker's, the more high-end of the two department stores. The way she dressed in college was not in line with her social class or background. It was, however, distinguished and very much in style. In terms of clothing, there was a shift in the 1920s from making to buying. Peter G. Filene writes, quote, the thousands of women who daily crowded the By the 1920s, the economic function of housewives was centered largely on what they bought with their husband's money, rather than on what they made, end quote. In Millay's case, she was not buying anything with her husband's money. She would have bought the tan linen dress with the money Caroline Dow raised for her, and later in life, the clothing she bought would have been with the money that she earned from writing. It is also clear from letters and diary entries that from childhood into the late 1910s, Millay did make some of her own clothes. However, it appears that when she had the funds available, especially later in life, she chose to buy clothes. A reporter from the World Telegram in 1931 writes, quote, "She buys the latest gowns and frocks and shoes and hats, then retires to her mountain fastness and puts them in closets," end quote. This press example shows that Millay's influencing of the general public was perhaps more towards fashionable feminine dress for the most part. Even early in her life, Millay's clothing choices often reflected fashionable trends. While her mother was away working as a private nurse, Millay would sometimes have friends over to their house in Camden. One friend, Ethel Knight, recalled Millay opening the door to her house wearing, quote, "a blouse of white muslin with cuffs and bone collar made from rose insertion with lace. A full gold skirt came to the top of her button boots. A padded leather belt circumscribed the wide equator around her tiny middle. A bright blue bow spread its wings behind her head, with her hair fastened in a bun," end quote. This event likely took place in 1908 when this kind of romantic ensemble was very fashionable. This shows Millay's keen interest in being fashionable, even though her family did not have abundant resources. This would have been at peak popularity of the Gibson Girl. Artist and illustrator Charles Dana Gibson of 700 Acre Island is credited with creating the first national beauty standard for women in America, the Gibson Girl. These pen and ink illustrations were published widely, including in Life magazine, where Gibson was the editor. In Gibson's illustrations, the Gibson Girl's clothing is often more suggestive than descriptive. She is usually seen in a full-length, full-board skirt, sometimes blowing in the wind. She often wears a shirtwaist, sometimes layered with a jacket, or an evening gown. The Gibson Girl silhouette with the large pompadour hair, puff sleeves, and long skirt can be seen on photography of women of the time. The short description of Millay's outfit from 1908 is no doubt influenced by the Gibson Girl standard of feminine beauty. Later in 1927, while protesting the Sacco and Vanzetti case, she was photographed wearing very fashionable women's clothing. Millay seemed to recognize the power of dress, and like many of the women's rights advocates, chose to dress fashionably and conventionally so as not to take away from her political message. While wearing the recreated 1914 tan linen dress, I was struck by a few things. Firstly, how this type of clothing was not made for lounging. The corset I wore underneath, which you can see on the dress form over there, was a recreation from the 1910s, encourages good posture. Even though the top was loose, the underlayers were not. This is why wearing the correct foundational garments is important when wearing historical clothing. Second, is the tightness of the belt and peplum. Millay likely had a corset on underneath the dress. We know from letters that she was wearing corsets in 1913. When sitting in the dress, I had to be conscious of not moving too forcefully, or else the snaps that held the side clothes would open. Perhaps this was a patterning or construction error, but I don't think so. I followed manuals at the time, and the skirt fits very similarly to the skirt in the photograph of Millay. The experience of making and wearing this recreation helps not only understand how the garment was made and worn, but also why she is so proper and feminine in the Arnold Gett photograph. The dress and the undergarments influence how you hold yourself. The 1925 publicity suit, on the other hand, is more structured than the top, but is worn with different undergarments and can therefore be worn with a more modern idea of comfort. I could slouch in the jacket like Millay does in the photograph. Another thing I noticed when I wore the 1925 suit ensemble was as soon as I changed out of the clothing back into my jeans and t-shirt, is that I had been uncomfortable, not physically, but mentally, the whole time I wore the recreation. It was clear that these were not my clothes. These reflections help in the understanding of her biography, and also how her clothing choices changed over the years. After she stopped wearing corsets, one assumes in the 1920s, as women in Greenwich Village at this time tended not to wear any corsets, just as the men did not wear ties. Millay also began to collect trousers, which she would wear in private, while not on display. Her choice of public clothing also followed in a similar vein of being more comfortable in the modern sense of the term. The feeling she experienced in not wearing a corset and starting to wear trousers is not something I am able to relate or speak to. Experiencing this historical change in clothing is not fully possible today. Another significant change occurred at this time when she bobbed her hair. Millay wrote in a diary entry in 1909 in Camden, quote, "I am tired of being grown up, tired of dresses that kick around my feet, tired of high-heeled shoes, tired of conventions and proprieties, tired and sick of hairpins." Making the clothing does allow me to engage directly with the original practice and techniques in construction of the time. These recreated garments put me in a headspace where I'm thinking about how they fit into a historical puzzle that we have moved beyond. So reflection is always in terms of what I know today versus what I am attempting to understand of a time period long since gone. The same would be true for how one wears these garments. Our perceptions are always in comparison to what we know about making and wearing garments today. Millay contains multitudes, but if one only looks at her biography and not at the clothing, one could argue she is quite the radical bohemian. Considering both the writing and the clothing, it is made clear that in her private life and her writing, she did exactly as she wanted. However, as a public persona, she was significantly more restrained, appearing by and large through a much more conventional presentation. In her personal life, she slept with whoever she wanted, drank as much as she wanted, wore trousers around the house, smoked in college when it was banned, swam naked, and wrote scandalous poems. This separation between her public and private persona is made abundantly clear in her choice of clothing. Design historian Penny Sparks suggests that, quote, "Like people, objects have lives, and their meanings change in response to the different context in which they are found," end quote. The trousers in the steeple-top garment database are all housewear, and we only have 5 easily accessible photographs of her in trousers, 2 of which she is wearing riding breeches in the company of her husband. Her public presentation at readings was almost exclusively through long fashionable gowns with trains. One explanation for this is that she did not want to take away from the power of her work by having the discussion in the press be about her unconventional presentation. Her clothing in this sense does not represent her unconventional personal life and sexuality. This presence of mind is also represented in the childhood name she published under, Vincent Millay. A name that could be assumed to be male and therefore have more power and possibility of respect than if she had published as Edna, a young girl. Later, after the power of Renaissance became clear, she published under her full name. Society and the power of women was also changing quickly in 1912 when Renaissance was published, and especially later in the 1920s. I believe this is also a significant factor in the power her full name came to hold in American society. Through both the use of her name and her clothing, Millay chose to both disguise and reveal certain aspects of her persona. These were the aspects of her life that she had complete control over, and she used them strategically. Millay makes clear her understanding of the metaphorical as well as the social power of clothing in her 1939 poem, The Plaid Dress. She constructs a metaphor of turmoil and the personal self through a garment that cannot be taken off. In a public event, the personal self is not necessarily seen, yet it is ever present. She describes the garment which faces the public as subtle. Millay chose to use this subtlety in public clothing choices in order to navigate various situations she either decided to put herself into, or alternatively, to protect herself from falling into. The plaid dress. Strong sun that bleached the curtains of my room. Can you not render colorless this dress I wear? This violent plaid of purple angers and red shames. The yellow stripe of thin but valid treacheries. The flashy green of kind deeds done through indolence, high judgments given here in haste. The recurring checker of the serious breach of taste. No more uncolored than unmade, I fear can be this garment I may not doff. Confession does not strip it off to send me homeward eased and bare. All through the formal, unoffending evening, under the clean, bright hair, lining the subtle gown. It is not seen, but it is there. Thank you.
So how much do you think that there might have been sort of the artist wanting to present her in that form, or that it was a collaboration of identity that, you know, being shown?
Maybe. I'm not sure. I mean, like, for this work, I didn't look very deeply into that. I was more focused on what Millay was wearing rather than maybe what she wore exactly in that photograph. Other than maybe it had something to do with Pulitzer Prize. But yeah, there could have been a collaboration there. But as far as I know, they were taken in like a photography studio. So Millay probably would have brought clothes with her, but I don't know if there was any discussion beforehand about what she would have brought. Well, that's a really good point. I should look into that. Yeah.
So it looks like you made your own patterns from...
Yes and no. The tan linen dress is almost entirely my own patterns. I mean, a lot of, like, the man's shirt and the skirt pattern were drafted from books that gave descriptions of how to draft a pattern based on different sizing things. You would plug in measurements, and then you would get the size of the pattern from there, and then lock it up and then adjust it. The suit is a pattern that I bought, which was, I think, a 1928 travel suit that I changed slightly so it looks a little more like the one in the photograph. But there's also, at the end, if you want to see, I brought one of the books that I used that shows some of the drafting patterns in it, how you do it, and what you can expect to get and how you can change it. They're very good about telling you how to do things. Nancy?
What's this different one here?
So that is steel, which from sort of 1910 onwards was mostly what was used, apart from in World War I. There's evidence of steel being requisitioned for the war effort. So you would use, sometimes they have reeds and stuff, and then like 15 years earlier in the 1890s they were using baleen, but that became scarcer and scarcer, so they switched to steel.
So, when did whalebone go out?
I think it started to go out sort of around 1900. I'd have to check that, but I think by then steel was starting to become more popular. But also with that, it's important to note it looks really long, but the bones don't go all the way down.
Right,
Yeah, the bones only go partway down, so it's like a corset from 1890 would basically be, it would come a little higher up and then would end where those bones end. So that extra fabric was usually put on. Changes in style, I don't know.
And what was this?
The dress form?
No, the undergarment.
Oh, so that there's two things going on there. There's a pair of combinations which started in the 1880s. Yeah. So that's what you would wear underneath your corset. A corset was never worn directly against the skin. So if you see that in period dramas, that's wrong. They're sort of on two different dress forms, but the way it would work is you would wear the combinations directly against your skin. You would put the corset on top of that, and then that thing hanging open around the combinations is the corset cover that you would wear on top. Where because this corset is slightly below the bust, the corset cover would be tighter and sort of act as a bra before a bra became invented, I believe, in like 1950. Yeah.
The brown linen one, which I love. I'm assuming that's much later, that you don't wear a corset under that. And what are they wearing under that?
You would wear a corset under that.
Oh, you would?
Yeah.
So she
likely was wearing a corset at that time because she was still at Vassar. And then in there's an example in a letter from 1913 where she describes herself wearing a corset. So that was taken in 1914, so she was probably still wearing corsets at that time. When she graduated that summer in 1917 and moved to Greenwich Village. It says in the Nancy Milford biography that women in Greenwich Village did not wear corsets. And men did not wear ties. They would wear the ties around their heads as like a sort of protest to fashionable men in their ties in New York City.
What were they wearing? What were the women wearing under there at that point?
Well, one of the things I didn't mention, but one of the 5 instances of Millay wearing trousers was a zouave suit. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I've only read it, I've never heard it pronounced, but it was based on the zouave uniforms, soldiers' uniforms that were used in various wars, but they have like big, sort of puffy legs that cinch around the ankle. And there's an example in Floyd Dell's memoir of her where she's dressing after an encounter with him and she's putting on a zouave suit, which probably had trousers. So she was certainly wearing that in Greenwich Village. And, you know, styles were changing, so you could get away with not wearing a corset in the 1910s if you were in certain social situations, in a way that you couldn't 10 years earlier.
Did you wear anything underneath? When you're not wearing a corset?
Well, it's a thing because you would have needed something to hold your stockings up in corsets. This one doesn't have it yet, but you would often have elasticated little things that would clip into your stockings to hold them up. Sometimes people would use garters, so they could have used those. So, and like, you know, garter belts later on, and in the 1920s, it's often said that women abandoned corsets, which just isn't true. And this is one of the things with the exhibition that had her clothing. They made all these claims that women were liberated in the 1920s, and then they showed what the 1920s undergarments looks like. And to me, it's way more restrictive than a corset. Like it goes like down to here, and it's all elastic. So you're sort of fighting against it instead of that, like which is open at the front, so you have, and there's no boning in it, so you have a lot more freedom to move. And having worn these, I could vouch to that. I would sooner wear a corset from the 1890s than a sort of 1920s girdle. Yeah, Angela?
What were the challenges of using period-appropriate equipment?
A lot. So I have 2 antique sewing machines, both of which I powered electronically. I'm not sure that's correct, but yeah. My treadle machine doesn't work, so I couldn't use that. But the machine I have from 1906 only stitches in a straight line and only stitches forward. So in order for anyone who sews, backstitch at the beginning of a line of stitches. So I would have to, and you would have seen it in the video a little bit, you'd have to take the piece you're stitching, you've just started it, set the needle down in it, pick up the foot, turn the thing around, stitch back, stick the needle in it, put it down, turn it around, and then you stitch, and then you do the same thing at the other side. And God forbid your bobbin runs out and you have to do that again in the middle. So that was really frustrating. And there were definitely times where I was like either working late or just tired, and I would just not do that. And then pay the price later because the stitches would be all wonky. Yeah.
Did she have one particular dressmaker, or how did it work? Did you go to whoever you knew, or what was the commitment between the dressmaker and the client?
So she has a poem about being fitted at a dressmaker's, which I didn't read. It's kind of just a description of what it was like, so it doesn't actually give us much insight into it, but you can look it up. I think it is actually just called The Dressmaker. And we know that she bought like Worth gowns in Paris, which are quite famous for anyone who knows anything about sort of evening gowns of that time. She bought a lot of clothes in Europe, like on her travels as well. She traveled through China on her honeymoon, and that's what that silk pantsuit that I showed is from. I assume that she bought stuff in department stores as well. I think there's some stuff about her husband also buying clothes for her, where he would sort of dress her. Like he refers in letters to her as his child. So there were times he would carry her, like they'd be dining with friends and it would be getting late, and he would basically say, "Oh, it's my child's bedtime." And he would come and pick her up and carry her upstairs and put her to bed, and he would come back downstairs and keep posting. Yes, she's a complicated person. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, how long did it take you to make each of these pieces?
tens of hours. The suit has, so there's videos for every single piece that I made on YouTube that you can see. So the dress is one video, and then there's 3 videos for the suit, one of the shirt, one of the jacket, and one of the skirt. So the skirt was probably the quickest. I think I probably did that, I don't know, 2-3 days. The jacket took weeks. If you go, please go and touch them, undo buttons and do what you want with them. But if you feel the collar and you flip the collar over, there's all of this hand sewing that goes into traditional tailored garments called pad stitching that supposedly shapes, you like do it around your finger and it shapes the collar and makes it want to fall back like it does. I didn't really do it right because I didn't know what I was doing, but like that alone, I think I had to unpick it and redo it 3 or 4 times, and I spent probably a week on just stitching the collar of something that you don't even see. But I was working on this from last summer through to probably March or April. Not every day, but I mean, there's probably 2 months in there where I was doing it every day, and sometimes I would just change and move to another piece just to get, something different. But it took a very long time. There's so much hand sewing that went into all of that, and you can see, like, go to the side and open up, you can see there's probably like 20 snaps and hooks and eyes in between all of these pieces, and each of those is sewn on by hand. Yes.
How did you source the fabric that you used, and what did you take into consideration when you were looking for that?
So, I assumed that the suit would be made of wool, and in the photograph it looks black. Just go back and try and find it. Oh, I didn't. Never mind. There's an initial photo of the 2 of them, but I kind of didn't want to just work with black on black, so I chose a really dark blue, which was my own decision, just for my own personal. And it was just whatever was the closest that was available in the fabric store in Montreal where I bought it. The lining of the jacket is silk because most linings were silk. So that was just sort of, we can't see the inside of the jacket in photographs, so we don't know. The shirt is cotton, and then I know that the dress was linen, and I bought that at the store in Belfast because they have quite a wide selection of colors of linen. But that linen, and you can compare this actually to the combinations, which are also linen. The combinations were made from an antique sheet, probably from the turn of the century. They were C. Douglas Dillon's sheets that I got. We were getting rid of them, so I was like, I'll take them. And that almost looks like cotton, but it's definitely linen. And you compare that weave to the weave of the dress, and you can see the difference in how linen was made historically versus today. And I haven't fact-checked this, but from what I've been told, is that they used to weave linen on linen looms. There were special looms just for linen, which is why they're so beautiful, and you can do something called drawing a thread, where you literally pull one thread out at one time, and it leaves a tiny gap in the fabric, and then you can cut along that gap to get a perfectly straight line. You cannot do that with modern linen. It just tears. So I couldn't do that with this dress. And the weave is way chunkier, and it just handles very differently. So it's not accurate.
Well, when I see all the handwork that you did with it,
Oh, that.
I gotta believe that it
Yeah.
was different for you than it was at the time.
Yes and no. So that book that I have there is a book for teaching a teacher how to teach sewing to various ages of people. So they say, in the first lesson, have them hold the fabric between their middle finger and thumb, tension it around your finger, and hold the needle pointing towards your body. And you think, okay, how am I going to do that? And then you're trying to do a whip stitch normally, and then you try that technique, and it works amazingly. So I was following techniques, hand sewing techniques in that book that teach you how to do it as it would have been. That book was originally published in 1895, I think, and then I have a reprint from the 1920s where they made some changes. So you literally hold the needle, so the thimble goes on your middle finger, never let the student take it off. Yeah, so you're following instructions.